Welcome back to Capital Crosstalk, where we'll be interviewing experts, activists, and more on the latest news. For this episode, we'll be diving into climate policy in the Biden era. Later, we'll speak with Professor Frank Maisano, a partner for Bracewell's Policy Resolution Group, who specializes in the energy and environmental sectors. But first, let's talk with Jeremy Liskar, a senior here at GW and co-founder of Sunrise GW, an activist organization dedicated to advocating for political action on climate change and fighting the climate crisis. Jeremy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So without further ado, let's get right into the questions. So for some people here at GW who might not know what the Sunrise movement is all about, just give us a brief history of like what Sunrise is all about and what got you into it and made you found a chapter here at GW.
Sure. So the Sunrise movement is a movement of young people across the country fighting for the Green New Deal, which we believe is the only solution to the climate crisis that meets it at the scale that science and justice demand. And for me, I got involved back in Sunrise in December of 2018, after Sunrise had a very high-profile sit-in in Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office with newly elected Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to demand that the House create a select committee on the Green New Deal to write the Green New Deal, so that when, hopefully when Democrats took control of the Senate and won back the presidency in 2020, we would be ready to go with a full plan. And what got me involved was really seeing and being inspired by that action, and Sunrise really presenting a solution to the climate crisis, that wasn't just talking about carbon taxes and things that we have to lose in this crisis, but talking about a better society that we can build and what we can gain from taking action in a way that protects all people, that makes sure that communities that are in transition from extractive industries, from the fossil fuel industry, are protected, that frontline communities of color that are facing the worst impacts of the climate crisis are protected. So that's what inspired me to get involved. And then I met another GW student who also got involved around a similar time. And we thought that it was really important to bring what Sunrise Movement was doing to GW, because the vision really speaks to people our age and to college students in particular, and that there was a lot that GW needed to do as an institution to better fight the climate crisis. Like for example, its continued investments in the fossil fuel industry at the time. We wanted to make sure that we could mobilize people around that on-campus issue, and then also keep that engaged group and put their efforts towards the national movement for federal climate legislation.
Yeah, so you brought up towards the end there some of GW's involvement with the fossil fuel industry, both through investments and through funding of certain think tanks and other organizations who may advocate for the use of fossil fuels. Obviously, that's what kind of bumped Sunrise into the front page of GW News for a little while at the end of fall last year and heading into spring. So what do you think GW needs to do to kind of combat climate change? And have they made any progress at all since you guys kind of brought that to the forefront of the community last year?
So through our work and through tons of petitioning and protests and strategic media interventions, giving GW bad press for what they were doing and things like that, we were really able to mobilize a huge section of the campus around this issue. And the pressure worked. Within just a couple months of this reignited movement, we were able to get the Board of Trustees to finally act. They created a task force on environmental, social, and governance responsibility, which a member from Sunrise GW, I was able to be on that task force and represent student interests. And through that work and continued pressure from the outside as well, we were in a span of just 6 months able to get GW to commit to fully divesting from fossil fuels and its endowment, move up their target for campus carbon neutrality from 2040 to 2030, get a commitment for GW to reverse its entire 200-year carbon footprint, commit to a center, or, like you said, a think tank on campus that focuses on sustainability or climate issues, and a bunch of other on-campus sustainability measures. Like we recently saw another product of that, GW committing to ending their use of single-use plastics. And all of that together has put GW really at the forefront for universities on climate action. They were falling behind, but with student pressure, we were able to get them right there. That said, there's still work to be done. Sunrise GW in particular right now is focusing on a think tank that is within GW called the Regulatory Studies Center.
Now, moving on from a more local level in college campuses to that national level you were speaking of, obviously Biden made it abundantly clear on his first day in office that climate change was at the kind of forefront of his campaign and would be one of the priorities for his presidency. So what do you and Sunrise make of these day one executive orders regarding climate change with the pipelines and rejoining the Paris Agreement? Do you like these moves? Do you not think it's enough? Just kind of what are your thoughts on this?
It's been really encouraging so far with his slew of executive orders at the beginning. In particular, I would highlight a few that we've been particularly excited about. First, he issued an executive order that stated that 40% of investments should be going to frontline communities in the climate crisis. We think that is really important. That's something that we've explicitly been pushing for a long time. And we saw that is a direct result of the organizing that groups like Sunrise have done, because it wasn't in his plan, his climate plan during the presidential primary. It got added after the Biden-Bernie Climate Policy Task Force, where Sunrise Movement's executive director was on that task force and advocated for that specific policy. So we're seeing direct results from our work, which is really exciting. And then I'd also highlight his axing of the Keystone XL pipeline. That's a fight that's been led for a really long time by indigenous peoples on the front lines, because pipelines not only are harming both, our local environments, and also, contribute significantly to climate change. But, they're also like violations of tribes, treaties and land, and infringing, potentially hurting their water supply and things like that. So it's really encouraging to see President Biden responding directly to the concerns and organizing of these frontline communities. And then I guess lastly, I'd highlight his executive order that created the Civilian Climate Corps, a federal jobs program for young people in particular, to get involved in protecting our communities from climate change.
Yeah, and I know you've said a few times that one big focus of the Sunrise Movement is pushing for the Green New Deal to pass Congress. Can you just kind of elaborate a little bit on how you think you see the Green New Deal getting through Congress, and if you think it'll make it through in its current form, or if it should be or has to be updated before it can pass both the House and the Senate to become law?
So first, I'd clarify that the Green New Deal is not one piece of legislation, right? When it was introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, it's a resolution, a 14-page resolution that lays out a framework for what we need to do to address the climate crisis at the scale that it demands. And it's a vision for a 10-year economic, society-wide mobilization to do just that. And we know that there's no silver bullet to the climate crisis. We know that one piece of legislation isn't going to get it done. It's going to be sustained investment that over this 10-year period really gets us in a position where we can bring down our emissions to zero. So in terms of getting the first few steps of that through Congress, what we've seen is that, like I mentioned, President Biden's climate plan has really improved since he was running in the Democratic primary. He listened to concerns from the progressive wing of the party, from frontline communities, and took a lot of the recommendations from the Biden-Bernie climate task force, and he improved his plan to include, this 40% of investments going to frontline communities. He put in a 2035 clean electricity standard so that we can get to 100% clean electricity by 2035, which is, a lot faster than he had previously committed to. He committed to like 2050, which we know is too late. In terms of it getting passed through Congress, so what we're going to see is that in the next couple of weeks, President Biden and leaders in Congress are going to introduce a clean energy infrastructure massive package, and we expect that to include a lot of the things in his climate plan from when he ran for president. So there's a lot of support in Congress for lots and lots of investment in infrastructure, and specifically green infrastructure, zero emissions infrastructure. So there's a big opportunity to do that, and also stimulate the economy and create millions of good paying jobs, which is needed when unemployment is so high right now.
So obviously in the House, there's no such thing as like a filibuster to stop potential legislation from passing there. But in the Senate, there's much more of an uphill battle for this legislation to pass, which Republicans have in the past vehemently opposed. What kind of concessions do you think are acceptable to be able to push a Biden climate plan through the Senate?
So no concessions are really acceptable. We want the plan to be as strong as possible. But we'll see what happens when they're whipping votes. But with regard to the filibuster, the Senate has one more opportunity this year to get a bill through the budget reconciliation process, which lowers the threshold needed from 60 votes to 50 votes. And we expect that this green infrastructure bill, most of Biden's climate plan, will be going through budget reconciliation. And that means that we don't need 10 Republicans in order to pass it. And that's a really big deal. That makes it plausible that it will pass. But as we're seeing with the COVID relief bill going through budget reconciliation right now, there is still like disagreement within the Democratic caucus in the Senate in particular. And with that, there needs to be consensus building in order for it to get through.
Go ahead to cap us off. What can our average listener at home, a lot of whom are students and parents of students, what can they do to get involved in climate action groups, both at GW and abroad, to kind of help push this agenda we've been talking about throughout this interview?
Yeah, so that correctly identifies the best way for people to get involved, because first, I'll just say before I mention some of the best groups that there are to get involved with, the fossil fuel industry has really looked to shift the blame of the climate crisis onto individuals in order to avoid responsibility for the crisis that they caused. Just 100 companies have been responsible for over 70% of global emissions. But they want you to think that, that recycling more and reducing your own personal carbon footprint, which are fine and good things to do, are the real culprits in the climate crisis, which is just not the case. So it's really important for people to get involved in trying to change things at a larger scale than just in our own individual lives. And to do that at GW in particular, first of all, of course, please join Sunrise GW. We're fighting the influence of the fossil fuel industry on campus, but then also in the coming weeks and months ahead, we're going to, given our position in DC for those who are here, but also for those who are not here, we're really going to try to leverage that in order to make some sort of impact on the upcoming fight over the federal climate legislation. But at GW, I'd also mention Black Defiance Green. They've been doing a lot of great work in terms of educating the GW community on environmental justice and making sure that we protect frontline communities and things like that. And I'd also, mention that Take Back the Tap GW has been doing great work to get GW to phase out single-use plastics. There are a lot of really great groups that are doing environmental work at GW, and there are so many different ways to get involved. And then lastly, I'd just say, call your senator about abolishing the filibuster. That's ultimately the only way that we are going to have a chance to pass the type of legislation that will allow us to continue climate action throughout this really crucial decade.
All right, well, thank you very much. That was Jeremy Liskar, senior at GW and co-founder of the Sunrise chapter here. Thank you once again for joining us and answering our questions.
Thank you.
Joining us now is Frank Maisano, a partner that leads the strategic communications practice in Bracewell's Policy Resolution Group. Professor Maisano focuses his communicative abilities on energy and environmental issues. When not working with international clients, Professor Maisano is an adjunct professor at the George Washington University in the SMPA program. Professor Maisano, thank you very much for joining us today.
Happy to be here, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
All right. So as you know, we've just transferred into a new administration away from Donald Trump and into Joe Biden's presidency. And with it comes a whole bunch of policy questions. And today, with your background and expertise, we wanted to focus a bit on climate change. And obviously, in your work, you talk with a large number of clients, from the oil industry to just energy companies to renewable energy. Obviously, Biden signaled a huge policy shift towards renewable energy and climate change. Have you seen any kind of major change in how these companies are acting and behaving and interacting with the administration since the new administration has come into office?
Well, it's really interesting, Kyle. I think we certainly have seen a change. There's no doubt about that. We've seen a change in how companies are preparing themselves for a new administration and the challenges of dealing with the new administration, whether they're supportive or not, right? At the same time, we've seen a market shift, right? We've seen the oil and gas industry, we've seen the renewable industry in many cases work together, right? And parts of the oil industry adopting parts of the renewable industry as part of their approach to dealing with long-term policy issues related to climate change. So, when you see a Total or an oil company or like the Norwegian oil company, which we represent, Equinor, who is also one of the largest offshore wind developers in the world, and certainly engaged in the Northeast here in New York and off the coast of Massachusetts, you really see kind of a convergence of the types of energy issues that are affecting the entire sector, right? So they're coming together. They're certainly trying to improve their processes and their efficiencies in the fossil fuel side. At the same time, they're investing in new projects that are renewables, that are really becoming part of the entire suite of things that they do to create and provide energy for consumers. So really, that's where things are headed, right? In the same space, you have lots of natural gas companies who for years have been allowing us to produce power at a cleaner rate. Now, it's still a fossil fuel, right? And some environmentalists want to get rid of that altogether. But the transition that we're going through right now is going to be really interesting. And the Biden administration is certainly headed in a different direction than the Trump administration did. But it's really not that different from where the Obama administration was 10 years ago, right? So we've seen this movie before, and industry has adapted to it. And I think they will adapt to it again, as they already are.
So one of the biggest moves so far in Biden's administration with regards to climate change actually happened on day one. Obviously, we saw him commit to re-entering the United States into the Paris Climate Accords. And then on that same day, through executive order, revocable federal land grants for the Keystone XL oil pipeline, which had an effect on thousands of jobs in the United States. So how do you foresee the energy sector reacting to Biden's kind of initiatives? And how do you think they can prepare to support the energy sector as some of these oil and natural gas jobs are being phased out?
For sure, Kyle. Great question. I mean, look, this is a two-parter, really. First, the Paris Agreement is something that I think a lot of people found common ground on, right? Businesses and industry were already engaged in that process. In fact, most of my clients, almost nearly all of my clients in the oil and gas space and the Chamber of Commerce and others like that, trade associations, they were strongly advocating the Trump administration stay in the Paris Agreement, partly because when you have a seat at the table, you can influence the debate. And what the Trump administration move did was just take us out of that realm, right? So now we were no longer even a factor. We were just kind of disregarded, and that was his mentality towards this thing. We're going to be America first, and we're not going to care about what the rest of the world is doing. Now, I don't think that was the right approach. Multiple businesses who are global, on a global scale, are working across the energy sectors, thought that was a bad idea. No matter what the policy turns out to be, right? So the reality is, on Paris, I think you're going to see a lot of agreement. You're going to see a lot of movement toward that process and get back engaged in that process. Where it ends up, I think, is going to be a point of contention. But the process of re-engaging it is exactly what we needed to do all along, and I think you'll find common ground there. On the other piece of this, the Keystone Pipeline, it's a real challenge for this administration, okay? This administration came into office with two significant interest groups promoting it, right? The progressives and the folks who are in the progressive line, and environmentalists fit into that category, along with many of the activists who opposed a lot of these pipelines throughout the country over the years. They were one group that was really energized and activated, right? At the same time, one of the reasons Trump won in 2016 was because blue collar unions, mostly white male workers, rejected the 2016 candidate Hillary Clinton and chose Trump because a lot of his America First type of approach, right? And his anti-trade deals and things like that. Those were union issues that they supported. So one of the reasons Biden was able to cut into Trump in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin in the Rust Belt there, where there are heavy union jobs, was because of his history and his support from unions and the workers in those unions, which Hillary Clinton just did not get. So there's really a push-pull right there between those things. And that was exemplified by the Keystone decision especially, but also some of the other decisions that we've seen since then, which are impacting oil and gas jobs and revenue across the country, but certainly in heavier oil and gas states like Texas and like New Mexico and like Louisiana, where those jobs are really important to the economy, to schools, to things like that. So that push and pull is really going to be a theme I think we'll see over the first 2 years at least of the Biden administration. Right now in the early stages, the progressives are kind of winning the day, but really a key factor. I mean, in fact, he's probably the most powerful Joe in Washington, D.C. today, and that's Joe Manchin, right? The senator from West Virginia, who is an energy user state that has been a supporter. He's the chairman of the Energy Committee. He's been influential in this 50-50 Senate. He's going to be really a powerful voice to kind of dictate where the Senate goes. And I think, he's going to lean more towards those union guys as we get into the heavier policy fights. So early on, the administration was able to do things that the administration could do by executive order. The Keystone Pipeline was one example because it was a very easy fix, and one that the Trump administration just did the opposite of when they came into office, right, from where the Obama administration was, because it needs a federal permit to cross the border from Canada. So, it's a challenge, and it's going to continue to be a challenge for this administration. The energy industry, meanwhile, is going to be alongside a lot of those union guys who are frankly getting good paying jobs. And too, that it's a big issue when Jennifer Granholm, in her first 3 or 4 speeches since becoming energy secretary, and all throughout her process of nomination, was, I mean, every other word she cited was clean green jobs, right? So that they know this is a big issue. That they are going to work hard to try and bring those union guys into the fold as much as they can. And it's going to be a push and pull, and we'll see where it ends up. In the end, I really feel like they'll be able to find a middle ground with progressives. That's going to bring some Republican support along with it. Unions. That's going to bring some Republican support along with it. I think more and more disappointed are going to be progressives as we move further down the road when the fights get tougher. And I think that's why he was so strong early on in pushing progressive moves.
Yeah. So do you foresee a time during the Biden presidency where the two parties can overcome those politics and, as you said, get down to business and actually make meaningful changes in the climate change space, in the environment, and with clean energy?
Oh, yeah, I for sure do, Kyle. I mean, really. And you know what? We've already done it while the Trump administration was in office. At the end of the Trump administration, when they were trying to pass that last budget, the other thing that moved along with the COVID package and the budget was the largest energy bill we've seen since 2005, 2007, maybe. And certainly the most heavily oriented climate change bill that Congress perhaps has ever passed, right? There was one provision in that bill which phased out HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which is a chemical that's used in air conditioning and refrigeration. And there's an international treaty that the U.S. was party to but never signed during the Trump administration. And there was legislation that both Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly supported and put into that package. And it's going to reduce temperatures by 0.5 degrees. And when you're trying to reduce from 2 to 1.5 degrees globally, that's a big deal, right? So stuff like that was in there. There were lots of funding for transmission and storage. There was lots of funding for carbon capture programs and things like that. It was a big, huge win for everybody in the energy space, no matter what side you run. That happened on December 29th of the Trump administration, right? So it really is a perfect example of how you can work together in a bipartisan fashion to develop some sort of program. Now, where are we as we go forward? That bill's a down payment on what we do, right? And a roadmap for how to get there, right? And so what do we do now? We are starting to see it already. There's a clean energy standard legislation that was introduced by a Republican and a Democrat, David McKinley from West Virginia and Kurt Schrader from Oregon. They proposed an innovate and then back it up with regulations, clean energy standard first over a time period. Just yesterday, in fact, or Tuesday, I should say, the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Frank Pallone, and his subcommittee chairman, Diana DeGette and Paul Tonko, proposed another form of a clean energy standard that could be part of this discussion. So I think what we're seeing is the rational policy discussion beginning, right? Versus for so long, we've talked about carbon taxes, right? And carbon taxes being a vehicle to do this. Well, nobody supports carbon taxes except for lots of companies who see it as an easier way to deal with this issue, and lots of think tank people who like to, again, see it as an easier way to deal with this issue. But politically, it's trouble, right? It always is trouble. And we've seen that in 1994 when the Clinton administration tried to move and Congress moved a BTU tax. We saw it in 2010 when the Democratic Congress and Senate tried to pass a cap and trade bill. All those things faced political firestorms eventually, and voters had their say. And so the historical perspective that we have from understanding where a carbon tax is makes it very difficult for a carbon tax to move politically. So what I think the moves by these members of Congress is setting the bar to say, hey, look, we have a mechanism that can work, that can draw stakeholder support, that can draw bipartisan support. We may not necessarily particularly agree on every detail as we go forward, but the mechanism as a clean energy standard is a place where we all can participate, right? Where we can all push and pull and try and get a deal out of that. So I'm very positive about where Congress can go, both Republicans and Democrats. I don't know where it will end up, but the fact that we're talking about a clean energy standard versus the Green New Deal or versus a carbon tax probably means that we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, and right at the end there, you brought up the Green New Deal, and that's actually what I want to end our interview on today, is that Green New Deal. Obviously popped up as a whole bunch of progressives got into Congress in 2018 and started pushing this legislation. Do you foresee any world where this administration and this Congress can negotiate on a Green New Deal and pass it by the time Joe Biden's out of office? And from your experience in the sector, what is kind of the talk in the background from energy companies? Are they worried about the legislation, looking forward to it? What has that kind of been like?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a Green New Deal is dead letter office in reality, right? Look, the Green New Deal is every progressive issue slammed into one thing and centered around the environment and calling it the Green New Deal. Now, that's a progressive wish list that's never going to happen unless they took over the Congress, which they will never do, right? Because the country is a center right country, and we've seen, even in the face of Donald Trump being rejected, we've seen Republicans actually winning seats, right? Like Susan Collins and others, and we've seen them actually close the gap in the House to make it more narrow, while the president was being defeated by Vice President Biden, now President Biden. So, it's hard to say that a Green New Deal will ever be in whole the direction the country is headed in. Now, the reality is that will be a starting point for many of the progressives when they discuss where they want to go with climate change, where they want to go with equity, where they want to go with all these other issues that are part of their approach, right? And it certainly means that it certainly will be a significant part of the discussion that we have. But there are lots of moderates, Joe Biden, Joe Manchin, Abigail Spanberger in the House as an example, Elise Slotkin, a Michigan congresswoman in the House, as a good example. Tim Ryan is another good example of that in Ohio, who's probably going to run for that Senate seat that's opened by Rob Portman in Ohio, and a good friend of mine. I do think that it's part of the debate. It's interesting, and it's always going to be a fascinating discussion. But it is just that it's, in theory, what a progressive wish list, and that just usually means that it's probably not going to be anything towards reality. Now, what does industry do? Industry is focused on producing a cleaner and greener product. It's producing a product that they can meet customer demand on. Those are important issues, right? That they can provide jobs for people on, that they can meet customers' demands in terms of price and things like that, so it's affordable. We need reliable and affordable energy constantly, and what's going to get us over that hump to keep our energy reliable and affordable and make it cleaner and greener is going to be innovation and new technologies like hydrogen and other things like that can help change the way we use energy, right? That's the solution. It's not a quick fix. It's a long-term solution. I've been involved in these issues since the late 90s, probably before many of you guys were born. So, it's the historical perspective we have and seeing how far we've come already tells me that we can make it, and we will do it in a way that is that still allows us to have cost-effective and reliable power, but makes it cleaner and greener and makes it more innovative than ever before.
All righty, that's a good positive note to end on. I want to thank you again for coming onto our show and being subject to our interview today. I think a lot of our listeners will find what you have to say very insightful.
Thank you, Kyle.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Capital Crosstalk. Thank you again to Jeremy and Professor Maisano for joining us and providing their perspectives on climate change policy today. If you want to hear our full-length interview, be sure to check out our podcast. Just search Capital Crosstalk wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to check out our social media at GW Capital Crossfire on Instagram and at GWTV Crossfire on Twitter to keep up with all things Capital Crossfire. Thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.